Everybody, welcome to week 2 of MCOM 500. I've enjoyed your posts and engagements a ton, and thanks a ton for your hard work on those. And I look forward to reading your answers to this week's prompts, which should be up. I just wanted to take a moment to talk at the outset of this lecture, this brief lecture, on unity and disunity, what unites us and what divides us in the field of communication. Begin with a quick anecdote about my favorite subject, myself. When I got to graduate school as a political science major, but I entered the graduate school in communication in 2002, I was at the University of Georgia. And I quickly understood, at least from that segment of the communication field, that in that program, there were two types of communication researchers. There were people who studied interpersonal communication research, how I might make you feel jealous in a family relationship, or how I might do relational repair and maintenance in a married relationship, how brothers and sisters or sisters and sisters talk to one another, that sort of thing. It was private, and those researchers typically used statistical methods. There was almost nobody, at least in that program at the time, who was using qualitative methods to study interpersonal research. Then on the other side of the house, the side of the house that I was on, those were folks who were interested in politics largely. These were people who feel comfortable in history and political science departments, but they just happened to study rhetoric, and they happened to study rhetoric through qualitative means. And so they're interested in big public political controversies of class and race and gender. They're interested in questions of revolution and political identity, what it means for me to be an American, what it means for me to be a Marxist or a capitalist, those sorts of bigger, larger questions. And so the division between these two groups of people was tremendous. Right? Philosophically, they were interested in very different things. Methodologically, they were studying those very different things in very different ways. And so aside from seeing one another at various communication parties or happy hours or whatever, we didn't have a ton in common. We didn't teach the same courses. We didn't take the same classes except for intro classes like this one. Then I went to do a PhD at Minnesota, and that old division, the division between interpersonal, or as we called it, IP, and rhetoric, disappeared because this communication department at Minnesota didn't even have interpersonal folks. There were one or two people who were studying it, but there weren't many students who were working with those professors, so it just wasn't an active part of it. There I discovered that there was another way to parse the field, which was between rhetoric, which was a foundational issue at Minnesota because it was one of the oldest PhD programs in America, and it began in the 20s, around the time that rhetoric was sort of taking over the field of communication. But then they also had a whole different section of the department that was studying media, right? Whereas I thought at Georgia that people who were interested in rhetoric were simultaneously interested in questions of dissemination and media and how audiences organize themselves around sources they prefer and against sources they don't particularly like. Here at Minnesota, those folks were completely separate from rhetoric. They weren't interested in speaking rhetorical vocabulary. They gave not a whit about the 4th through the 6th century. They couldn't spell Isocrates. It just was not relevant to them. They were intellectually buoyed by a whole different tradition of European studies, out of cultural studies, largely in England, and then in some areas, some schools in the United States like Illinois or NYU. And so the people who were interested in media were teaching very different courses than the courses taught by people who were interested in rhetoric, even though to me, they seemed like family. There was a family relationship between the two. At both of those schools, at Minnesota and Georgia, I found that there was another peculiar tradition, another peculiar split in the field, which was that there were two separate communication majors. You could major in mass comm and journalism at Georgia and at Minnesota, or you could major in speech communication or communication studies. Those two sets of professors almost never saw one another. They taught totally different classes, with one on media production, some on journalism, how do you do an interview, how do you write the so-called nut paragraph, how do you avoid burying the lead, how do you get a job in journalism, and then other folks who were interested in media historically, philosophically, rhetoric, and so forth. Then I got a job here 10 years ago, happy anniversary to me, at the College of Charleston, and yet again, an entirely different way to organize the field of communication, which was we only have one major in communication, and we have an omnibus department, which means that we have people, faculty from all areas of the discipline. People in public relations, people in marketing, people who are historians of political language like myself, people who are organizational communication scholars, people who study leadership, people who study interpersonal communication using statistical methods, people who study philosophy of communication and media in the Enlightenment era. Right? We really span the entire gamut of the field here at the College of Charleston's Communications Department. We don't have nearly as many splits among the field. But in all of those senses, every place I've been, those three schools, I have also seen how not only do we organize ourselves around different labels, whether it's speech communication, communication studies, media studies, interpersonal communication, and so forth, but we also go to very different conferences, socialize with different people, and then as a result, recruit very different kinds of students to ask very different kinds of questions. So as we go forward in this lecture, I'd ask you, and then especially in your posts and engagements this week, I would ask you to just keep two questions in mind. Well, three really. What unites us? What divides us? And which one is most important? In other words, are there more points of unity or more points of division?